Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a story that I think, we all feel like we know, a story that's become almost a modern myth. We're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It's the moment, isn't it? The single closest the world has ever come to complete annihilation. 1 minute to midnight.
Exactly. But here's the thing that's always bothered me. The way it's taught, the way it's usually portrayed in movies, it's this very clean intellectual conflict. It's a high-stakes chess match.
Right. You have John F. Kennedy in the White House, Nikita Khrushchev in the Kremlin, two grandmasters moving pieces on a global board.
And it's presented as this very rational process. They stare each other down, they measure their options, and eventually one of them blinks and the world is saved. It's actually a pretty comforting story when you think about it.
It is comforting because the subtext of that story is control. It implies that the men in charge, the leaders, had their hands firmly on the wheel the entire time.
But the source material we're digging into today paints a completely different picture. We're going deep into Michael Dobbs's book, 1 Minute to Midnight. And the story he tells isn't a chess match. It's more like a runaway train.
Or a car crash in slow motion. The central mission of this book, and it's a brilliant one, is to move beyond those dry academic studies of decision-making, to get past the rational actor models and tell the actual human story.
The messy story.
The messy, chaotic, and frankly terrifying story. Dobbs didn't just reread the declassified White House tapes. He went to Russia after the archives opened. He found the Soviet veterans who were actually on the ships, the guys handling the nukes, people who had never, ever been interviewed by a Western writer before.
And he doesn't just talk to them. He uses their testimony and recently declassified logs to plot the actual positions of the ships, day by day, hour by hour.
He brings it down to the ground level. And that's where the real horror of the crisis lies. It's not in the choir rooms in Washington. It's in the thousands of other people, the subplots that were unfolding at the same time.
You're talking about saboteurs in rubber dinghies paddling through Cuban swamps while peace talks are happening.
I'm talking about American pilots with live nuclear weapons crashing on runways in the middle of Indiana.
This is the terrifying disconnect, right? The gap between the leaders like Kennedy and Khrushchev, who are trying desperately to manage a crisis, and this vast, unthinking machine of war that was already in motion.
Dobbs uses this great quote from Kierkegaard. History is lived forwards, but understood backwards. When we look back, we see this neat 13-day timeline. Day 1, Day 2, resolution. It all makes sense.
But if you were living it, if you were JFK or just a Soviet conscript sweating in the hold of a ship, you had no idea what was happening next. It was just a terrifying cascade of accidents and close calls.
So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to try to live it forwards.
Let's do it. Let's get into the weeds. It all kicks off on Tuesday, October 16th, 1962. It's just before noon in Washington.
The setting is the Oval Office. And the man walking in is Arthur Lundahl. He's the chief at the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center, a place filled with brilliant, quirky analysts, and he's holding a series of large photographic blow-ups.
And these photos from the descriptions in the book, they don't look like much. Not to a civilian eye, anyway. JFK himself apparently said one of them just looked like a football field.
Exactly. The official description was innocuous, almost bucolic. To you or me, they're just grainy black and white pictures of a clearing in a forest. Some dirt roads, some tents.
But Lundahl and his team weren't looking at the big picture. They were looking at the geometry. They were looking at the shadows. And this is where the really amazing tradecraft comes in.
They had this specific piece of equipment called the Man Model 621 comparator.
It sounds like something out of a James Bond movie. What did this thing actually do?
Think of it as a huge, room-sized computer fused with a high-powered stereo microscope. The U-2 spy plane would take these two-dimensional photos just seconds apart as it flew over. The comparator allowed the analyst to view those two flat images together in 3D.
So they could see the depth.
They could see the depth, but more importantly, they could measure things on the ground with unbelievable precision. By analyzing the angles and the shadows, they could calculate the size of an object down to the inch from an altitude of 70,000 feet.
70,000 feet. It's just staggering. So they're not guessing at what they're seeing. They are measuring.
They are measuring. And when they ran the numbers on these long, canvas-covered objects lying in that Cuban field, the machine came back with a very specific measurement.
67 feet?
67 feet. And that number was a bell ringer. It was the fingerprint. It matched perfectly with the known dimensions of the Soviet R-12 ballistic missiles, which NATO had designated the SS for.
The very same missiles they had seen with their own eyes being paraded through Red Square in Moscow just a few months earlier.
The very same. Medium-range ballistic missiles, each one carrying a warhead about 70 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, capable of hitting Washington, D.C., New York, Dallas. Basically the entire southeastern United States.
Now, the classic story is that Kennedy remains cool, calm, and collected, the statesman. But the sources Dobbs uses, the private reactions, they suggest something much more visceral.
Oh, he was furious. It wasn't just a national security threat for him. It was a deep personal betrayal.
Because you have to remember the political context. The midterm elections are just 3 weeks away.
And the Republicans are hammering him on Cuba. They're calling him weak, inexperienced. There's a Republican senator from New York, Kenneth Keating, who has been standing up on the Senate floor for weeks, basically screaming that the Soviets are putting offensive missiles into Cuba.
And the White House has been flatly denying it.
They had to. They sent out George Bundy, his national security advisor, to go on the Sunday talk shows and state unequivocally, there are no offensive weapons in Cuba, and there will not be. Khrushchev himself had sent secret back-channel messages to Kennedy, promising him he wouldn't do anything to cause trouble or embarrass him before the election.
So when JFK's looking at these photos, he realizes two things. One, the country is in incredible danger. And two, he's been played. He's been made to look like a fool.
He's been lied to, directly. And his first thought, and this is right there in the transcripts from the first meeting, it's not about nuclear war, it's about domestic politics. He turns to his aides and says, almost in disgust, Ken Keating will probably be the next president of the United States.
That's just wild. The world is on the brink of ending, and his mind immediately goes to the next election cycle.
It's so human, though, isn't it? His credibility was on the line. He felt double-crossed, and his mind flashed back to his first and only meeting with Khrushchev at the Vienna summit in 1961.
Which did not go well for Kennedy.
It was a disaster. Khrushchev, this older, experienced, and frankly bullying figure, just ran circles around the young president. He treated Kennedy like an inexperienced little boy, a rich kid who was out of his depth. JFK walked out of that meeting and told a reporter, he just beat the hell out of me.
So now in October of '62, Kennedy isn't just seeing missiles in Cuba. He's seeing Khrushchev doing it to him again, pushing him around on the world stage.
It was personal. He kept saying, he can't do this to me. The feeling was, if he let Khrushchev get away with this, what's next? They'll push on West Berlin. They'll push in Southeast Asia. He felt he had to draw a line in the sand right there and then.
So he brings together this group that would become known as the ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, to figure out what to do.
And this is the room where it happens. This is where the famous hawk versus dove debate kicks off.
The popular history, again, simplifies this. But looking at the transcripts that Dobbs highlights, there's one voice in that room that is louder, more aggressive, and more certain than anyone else's. General Curtis LeMay.
LeMay is a character who almost feels like he's from a movie. He's the Air Force Chief of Staff, the architect of the firebombing of Tokyo in World War II, a strategy that killed more people than the atomic bombs. He was a man who believed in one thing and one thing only: overwhelming, crushing force.
He had zero time for diplomacy or subtlety.
None. He looked at the map, he looked at the strategic balance, and he saw a golden opportunity. He argued correctly that the United States had a massive superiority in nuclear weapons at the time, something like a 17-to-1 advantage.
So in his mind, it's simple math.
It's simple math. He sees the Soviet missiles in Cuba not as a threat, but as a trap that Khrushchev has walked into. His advice to the president was direct and brutal. He said, let's take his leg off right up to his testicles.
My God, he actually said that to the president of the United States.
The military transcripts from these meetings are filled with this kind of language. For LeMay, this was the moment to end the Cold War, right then and there, a preemptive strike.
So when Kennedy and some of the others, like McNamara, float the idea of a blockade.
Which they start calling a quarantine, because a blockade is technically an act of war.
Right. When they float the idea of a quarantine, LeMay just scoffs at it.
He sees it as weak, cowardly, and dangerous. And he uses a comparison that is designed to be as insulting as possible to John F. Kennedy. He compares it to the Munich Agreement of 1938.
The appeasement of Hitler.
The great historical sin of appeasement. And that's a dagger aimed directly and personally at JFK, because JFK's own father, Joe Kennedy, had been the ambassador to the United Kingdom in the late 30s, and he was a prominent supporter of appeasement.
So LeMay is essentially standing in the cabinet room and telling the president to his face, "You're about to be weak, just like your father was."
The tension in that room must have been absolutely suffocating. But Kennedy pushes back. He resists LeMay's logic. And it's a fascinating question. If LeMay is right about the nuclear superiority, why not just strike and get it over with?
Because Kennedy was thinking about the next step.
He was operating on a completely different level of logic. LeMay was playing a purely military game. We have more bombs, so we win. Kennedy was playing a game of survival. He kept asking the generals about the spasm response.
What exactly did he mean by a spasm response?
It's this idea that nuclear war isn't like chess. You can't just make one move. If you launch a massive airstrike on Cuba and you kill thousands of Soviet soldiers, which you would have, Khrushchev has to respond. He cannot look weak.
So maybe he doesn't launch his missiles from Russia. Maybe he invades West Berlin.
Exactly. And then according to our treaty obligations, NATO has to respond to that. And then the missiles start flying everywhere. It's a reflex, a spasm. Kennedy understood that winning a nuclear war was a meaningless concept if 70 million Americans died in the process. He wanted to give Khrushchev what he called a golden bridge, a way to retreat without total humiliation. LeMay just wanted to blow up the bridge.
While this incredibly high-stakes debate is raging in the White House, I want to pivot to the other side of the story. Because the operation to get these missiles to Cuba in the first place is one of the most audacious deceptions in modern history. Operation Anadir.
It was a logistical masterpiece of trickery.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the challenge. The Soviet Union needed to move over 40,000 troops, nuclear missiles, tactical bombers, and all their support equipment halfway around the world, right under the nose of the U.S. Navy and the CIA.
How on earth do you hide an army on the open ocean?
You lie. And you lie at every single level. The official cover story was that these were just agricultural experts and irrigation specialists going to help the Cubans with their harvest.
Which is pretty thin.
It's very thin.
Yeah.
So the real deception, the maskirovka, as the Russians call it, went much deeper. As they were loading the 85 transport ships in various Soviet ports, they made a great show of loading winter equipment.
Winter equipment to go to Cuba.
Exactly. They loaded crates of skis, thousands of pairs of heavy felt boots called valenki, thick parkas. The idea was to fool any Western spies watching the docks. If you see an army being loaded onto ships with Arctic gear, you logically assume they're heading north.
Maybe to establish a new base in the Arctic Circle?
Precisely. To Novaya Zemlya or somewhere like that. The deception was so total that even the ship captains had no idea where they were going.
So they're just told to cast off and sail.
They were given a series of sealed envelopes with wax seals. The order was, do not open packet number 1 until you have passed the Turkish Straits. So they sail out into the Mediterranean. The captain opens the packet. The new orders say, proceed to the Strait of Gibraltar.
And once they pass Gibraltar?
Open packet number 2. They only found out they were actually going to Cuba once they were far out in the Atlantic, well past the point of no return.
Just imagine for a second that you're one of those young Soviet soldiers. You're 19 years old. You're told you're going on an important mission to the frozen north, so you mentally prepare yourself for the bitter cold. And then the ship turns south into the tropics.
And the conditions on those ships were, and this is not an exaggeration, horrific. Dobbs gets first-hand accounts of the voyage of a ship called the Omsk. The soldiers were crammed into the tween decks, which are the cargo spaces below the main deck, below the waterline.
So no portholes, no air.
No ventilation at all, just a steel box. As the ship crossed the Atlantic and entered the Caribbean, the temperature inside that metal hold reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit.
120 degrees, that's potentially lethal.
It was close to it. The humidity was measured at 95%. The food they were given was rotting in the heat. There was rampant seasickness, men vomiting constantly. The average weight loss for a soldier on that trip was 22 pounds. They were literally being cooked alive in these floating steel ovens for weeks.
And when they finally arrive in Cuba, it's not like they can just get off the ship and breathe fresh air. The secrecy continues.
The secrecy is paramount. They have to be unloaded at night in remote ports. And they can't wear their Soviet military uniforms. So the KGB had procured these ill-fitting civilian clothes for them. Checkered shirts, baggy trousers. One soldier said they looked like a bunch of scarecrows.
And they were given one final crucial order.
Do not speak Russian. under any circumstance.
So what were they supposed to do? They were suddenly expected to speak Spanish.
They didn't know a word of Spanish. For the most part, they were told to just remain silent, which is impossible when you're trying to unload heavy missile equipment. They were given these little cheat sheets. If you wanted a convoy of trucks to stop, you were supposed to shout, cuatro, cuatro. To go, it was dos, tres.
That sounds like a recipe for absolute chaos.
It was a complete disaster. In the heat and confusion, with American spy planes starting to buzz overhead, the discipline just collapsed. You'd have Russian sergeants forgetting the Spanish and just screaming very distinctive Russian swear words to get the drivers to move. It was a comedy of errors, but the stakes couldn't have been higher.
It really begs the fundamental question, why? Why would Khrushchev take such an enormous, reckless gamble? Was it purely a strategic move to threaten the United States?
It was partly strategic, absolutely. Khrushchev felt that the balance of power was unfairly tilted against him. The United States had recently placed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy.
Right on his doorstep.
Literally. Khrushchev had a dacha, a vacation home on the Black Sea, and he used to love to stand on the balcony, hand a pair of binoculars to his guests and say, "I can see the American missiles from my dacha." He felt surrounded, and he wanted to give the Americans a taste of their own medicine to equalize the balance.
But Dobbs makes a strong case that it wasn't just cold, hard strategy. It was also emotional for Khrushchev.
Deeply emotional. You have to remember, Khrushchev was a true believer. He genuinely believed in the cause of international socialism. And he had this romantic, almost fatherly affection for the young Cuban Revolution. He saw Fidel Castro as like a son.
He wanted to protect this little socialist experiment 90 miles from Florida.
He wanted to be its patron and protector. And being Khrushchev, this man of the earth, he used a very vivid metaphor to describe his motivation. He told his inner circle that he wanted to throw a hedgehog down the pants of Uncle Sam.
That is quite an image.
It's pure Khrushchev.
Yeah.
He didn't necessarily want a war. He wanted to make the Americans jump, to make them feel the same fear and vulnerability that he felt. He fundamentally believed he could pull this off as a fait accompli, get the missiles installed, turn them on, announce it to the world, and Kennedy would just have to accept the new reality. He completely misread the American reaction.
Okay, so we have the missiles arriving in Cuba. We have the White House descending into a state of controlled panic. But there is this third element to the story that, for me, is the most shocking part of the book, the secret war.
This gets right to the heart of that disconnect we talked about. Because while the diplomats and the generals are debating in the XCOM, there's another war already being fought, Operation Mongoose.
And this was the code name for the U.S. covert program to overthrow Fidel Castro.
And it was being run with an almost fanatical obsession by none other than the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy.
The president's own brother.
Yeah.
We usually think of RFK during the crisis as the cool-headed dove, the one who wrote the book 13 Days.
And he did play that role in the XCOM meetings. But Dobbs shows us the other side of him, the Mr. Hyde, to his Dr. Jekyll. Before the crisis, RFK was the driving force behind Mongoose. He held meetings every week, pushing the CIA, berating them, demanding action. He was obsessed with getting rid of Castro.
And in their desperation to please him, the CIA came up with some, let's just say, some creative plans.
That's putting it mildly. The head of operations for Mongoose was this legendary CIA figure, General Ed Lansdale. And he proposed a plan that was officially codenamed Elimination by Illumination.
Elimination by illumination. You have to explain that one.
Okay, get this. The plan was to have a U.S. submarine surface off the coast of Havana at night. It would then fire star shells, these big magnesium flares, into the sky, lighting up the whole city. At the very same moment, CIA agents on the island would spread a rumor that this celestial event was the second coming of Christ.
And that Castro was the Antichrist.
And that Castro was the Antichrist. The theory was that the deeply Catholic and superstitious Cuban peasantry would see the lights, hear the rumor, and rise up at a holy rebellion to overthrow the communist regime.
You cannot be serious. That was a real plan that was discussed at the Pentagon.
It was seriously proposed and debated. Fortunately, even the Hawks thought it was a bit much. But they also had other, almost equally bizarre ideas. Like, Castro had successfully branded the anti-communist exiles as gusanos, which means worms.
It was a very effective slur.
So Lansdale's team decided they needed to reclaim the word. They launched a propaganda campaign called the Free Worms, trying to turn it into a badge of honor.
I am a free worm. It doesn't quite have the same ring as give me liberty or give me death, does it?
It was pathetic. But here's the incredibly dangerous part. It wasn't just silly PR campaigns. Operation Mongoose had active sabotage teams. And even as the crisis escalated, as the U.S. military went to DEFCON 3, then DEFCON 2, nobody thought to call these teams off.
You're talking about the mission to the Matahumri copper mine.
Exactly. This is a sequence in the book that reads like a thriller novel, but it's all true. The CIA had recruited and trained 2 Cuban exiles, a man named Orozco and another named Vera. Their mission was to blow up a crucial aerial tramway at this major copper mine to disrupt the Cuban economy.
And they were sent in during the missile crisis.
In the middle of it, they took a high-speed launch from a secret base in Florida, transferred to a small rubber dinghy in the middle of the night, and began navigating through the dense mangrove swamps on the Cuban coast to reach their target.
The insanity of that. If they had been caught, if the Cubans had paraded 2 CIA-trained saboteurs on television,
It would have been proof positive for Khrushchev that Kennedy was not negotiating in good faith, that he was still actively trying to overthrow the Cuban government. It could have completely torpedoed any chance for a peaceful resolution.
the left hand literally did not know what the right hand was doing.
Or maybe a better way to put it is that the covert action machinery was so large and had so much momentum that once it was set in motion, no one really knew how to turn it off.
Which brings us perfectly to what you call the chaos factor. Because if the secret agents and saboteurs didn't accidentally trigger World War III, a series of sheer dumb accidents almost did.
The fog of war isn't just a cliche, it's a terrifying reality. The moment the U.S. military went to its highest state of alert, DEFCON 2, things just started to break down under the strain.
For example, the Strategic Air Command began dispersing its nuclear bombers.
Right. The fear was a Soviet first strike that would wipe out our bombers on their main bases. So the plan was to scatter them across the country, landing them at dozens of civilian airports.
So you have these massive B-47 bombers, each one carrying nuclear weapons, landing at places like
Logan Airport in Boston, O'Hare in Chicago, major international airports.
Right.
Just imagine you're a passenger waiting to board your Pan Am flight to London, and you look out the window and see a strategic nuclear bomber taxiing past.
It must have been absolute chaos.
The civilian infrastructure just wasn't ready for it. Dobbs tells this incredible, almost funny story about a B-47 pilot who landed at a civilian airfield and realized they didn't have the military forms to requisition jet fuel. He actually had to use his personal air travel card, which is basically a government-issued credit card, to buy fuel for his nuclear bomber.
And can I get some points for that? That is unbelievable.
Another bomber landed on a runway that wasn't strong enough for its weight, and its wheels got stuck in the soft tarmac. It just shows how much of the response was being improvised on the fly.
But the incident that truly stops your heart took place in Indiana at a place called Holman Field.
The crash of the F-106, yes. The pilot is Captain Daryl Gitson, nicknamed Gid. He's an interceptor pilot on high alert. And because the threat level is nuclear, his F-106 jet is not carrying training missiles. It's armed with a live MB-1 Genie rocket.
And the Genie is not a conventional weapon.
Not at all. It's a nuclear air-to-air rocket. It has a 1.5 kiloton warhead. The idea is you fire it into a formation of incoming Soviet bombers, and a nuclear blast wipes them all out of the sky at once.
So he has a live nuclear weapon on his plane.
He does, and the scramble horn blows a potential incoming threat. Goodison takes off. There's a problem with his plane. He has to abort the mission immediately because back on to land, he's coming in hot and he deploys his drag chute to slow the plane down.
And the chute fails.
The mechanism breaks. The chute just rips away from the plane. Now he's going way too fast. He stands on the brakes, the tires blow out, showering the runway with sparks. The plane smashes through the safety barrier at the end of the runway, the landing gear shears off, and the whole thing belly flops into an adjacent cornfield and catches fire.
And the nuclear missile is still attached to the wreckage.
The nuke is sitting right there in a burning airplane in an Indiana cornfield. Now, thankfully, the warhead had multiple safety mechanisms. It was never going to have a full nuclear detonation. But what if the conventional explosives in the warhead had cooked off in the fire?
You would have had a dirty bomb, radioactive material scattered all over the Midwest.
And imagine the news reports. Nuclear accident in Indiana. In the absolute peak moment of crisis, with the president about to go on television to announce the blockade. The public panic alone could have been enough to force the president's hand into a military strike. It was a miracle.
It's a miracle it didn't happen. But while we were dealing with our own accidents, we were also operating under a massive intelligence failure. We thought we knew what weapons were in Cuba, and Dobbs shows that we were dangerously wrong.
Completely and utterly wrong. The official CIA assessment, the one being given to Kennedy and the XCOM, was that while the missile sites were clearly being built, the nuclear warheads themselves had not arrived on the island yet.
And why did they believe that?
It was a classic case of mirror imaging. We assumed the Soviets would handle their nuclear weapons the same way we did. When we store nukes, we put them in hardened, high-tech concrete bunkers. We surround them with triple-layer security fences, guard towers, the works.
And when the U-2s flew over, they didn't see any of that.
They saw nothing like that. So they concluded, logically, that the warheads weren't there. But the Soviets, in their rush, were improvising. The truth was, there were already 162 Soviet nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba, and they were hiding them in plain sight.
You have to tell the story of the van at La Isabela.
It's my favorite detail in the entire book for its sheer, terrifying absurdity. At the port of La Isabela, the multi-megaton warheads for the R-12 missiles, the big strategic ones, were being stored in a plain metal van, just a truck trailer. It was parked in a clearing near the docks, and the only security was a couple of guys with rifles and a herd of goats that roamed around the area.
Goats. Guarding the apocalypse.
And because the U.S. photo analysts looked at the pictures and saw no fences, no bunkers, no guard towers, they just marked it on their maps as a vehicle park.
Yeah.
They completely missed it.
And the situation with the tactical nukes was even worse, right? The bombs for the Il-28 bombers, the ones they called Tatyanas.
The Tatyanas were being stored in a simple wooden shack. And it was so hot and humid inside this shack that the Soviet technicians were terrified that the delicate electronic circuitry in the bombs would overheat and fail. So they had to invent a jerry-rigged air conditioning system.
And by air conditioning system, you mean?
They took a propeller from a boat, hooked it up to a diesel generator they had lying around, and just aimed it at the shed to blow air on the nuclear bombs.
A boat fan. That was the safety system for a dozen tactical nuclear weapons.
High-tech Soviet engineering. But here is the truly terrifying implication of this intelligence failure. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, men like LeMay, were pushing Kennedy every single day for a full-scale invasion of Cuba.
And their plan assumed they would be facing conventional resistance.
They thought they would be fighting Cuban soldiers with rifles. But if the U.S. Marines had hit those beaches, they would have been walking directly into a battlefield saturated with Soviet tactical nuclear weapons. Nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, short-range battlefield rockets.
The entire invasion force would have been vaporized.
Instantly. And the United States' own war plan stated that any use of a nuclear weapon against U.S. troops would be met with an immediate, full-scale nuclear retaliatory strike on the Soviet Union. That was the trap. We were hours away from stumbling into a nuclear buzzsaw because we couldn't imagine that the enemy would store their nukes in a goat pasture.
So, Kennedy resists the calls to invade. He chooses the blockade, the quarantine. He wants to send a firm signal of resolve without actually starting a shooting war. But to execute a blockade, you need the Navy. And this leads to a legendary showdown in the Pentagon.
It's one of the great scenes of the crisis. It's the ultimate clash of cultures. In one corner, you have the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, the whiz kid from Ford Motor Company, the man who believes that any problem can be solved with data, logic, and systems analysis.
And in the other corner,
You have Admiral George Anderson, the Chief of Naval Operations. They called him Gorgeous George. He was old-school Navy through and through. Proud, arrogant, and believes completely in the traditions and the autonomy of his service.
And McNamara comes into the Navy's command center and starts essentially micromanaging the blockade.
He does. He starts grilling the admirals with these very specific hypothetical questions about the rules of engagement. He's treating it like a business problem. He asks, what do you do if a Soviet ship refuses to stop when you hail it? The admirals say, we fire a shot across its bow.
Okay, and McNamara says,
And what if it still doesn't stop? Then we fire into its rudders to disable it. And then McNamara asks the killer question. And what if you fire into its rudders and you sink the ship and it turns out to be full of baby food?
the famous baby food scenario.
Exactly. McNamara was obsessed with the idea that a single mistake, a single hot-headed Navy captain, could cause a PR disaster that would trigger the war. For him, the blockade wasn't a military operation. It was a form of communication. It was a political signal to Khrushchev.
But for Admiral Anderson, it was combat.
For Anderson, this civilian telling him how to run his Navy was an insult. He got so angry that he picked up a copy of the Manual of Naval Regulations, the 1955 edition, and literally started waving it in McNamara's face, saying, this is how we do things.
He waved the book at the Secretary of Defense.
He did. And McNamara finally snapped. He pointed his finger at Anderson and said, Admiral, there will be no shots fired at any ship without my express permission. And Anderson shot back, Mr. Secretary, the Navy will conduct the blockade in accordance with its long-standing traditions. He essentially told his boss to get out of his command center.
It just shows again how fragile that top-down control really was. Kennedy and McNamara are sitting in the White House, terrified that some captain hundreds of miles away is about to start World War III without their permission.
And they had every reason to be worried. Because it wasn't just surface ships. Lurking beneath the waves were 4 Soviet submarines. Diesel-powered Foxtrot-class subs sent to the Caribbean to protect the cargo ships.
And the U.S. Navy was actively hunting them.
They were. But here's another secret element of the story. The U.S. had a massive hidden advantage, a top-secret network of underwater microphones on the ocean floor called SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. We could hear those Soviet subs from hundreds of miles away. We were tracking their every move.
And the Soviets had no idea.
None. The Soviet admiral in charge, Khrushchev, realized way too late that he had sent his submarines into a death trap. They were noisy, they had to surface frequently to run their diesel engines and recharge their batteries, and they were heading right for the narrow choke points between the islands of the Bahamas.
So you have U.S. destroyers overhead, tracking these subs, dropping practice depth charges on them.
They called them signaling charges, but to the crew in the sub below, an explosion is an explosion.
And those submarine crews are exhausted, they're running out of air, the temperatures inside are over 100 degrees, and they're being hammered by explosions. And what we didn't know at the time.
What we didn't know until decades later is that at least one of those submarines was armed with a torpedo that had a nuclear warhead. And the captain of that sub, cut off from Moscow, believing war may have already started, had the authority to use it. The decision to launch was in the hands of a few exhausted, terrified men deep underwater.
Let's shift our focus to the island itself. Because we talk so much about the Americans and the Russians, but we can't forget about the Cubans. What was the mood on the ground in Havana?
In a word, mobilization. Absolute, total war footing. Castro put the entire country on the highest state of alert. The slogan that Dobbs quotes from the time was, "Cuba was one man and his rifle." Every able-bodied person was given a weapon.
And not just rifles.
Not just rifles. If they ran out of guns, they handed out machetes from the sugarcane fields, meat cleavers from butcher shops, anything that could be used as a weapon.
Machetes against a U.S. invasion force.
It wasn't about winning a conventional battle. It was about the spirit of resistance. The national mood was patria o muerte, motherland or death.
And you have to get inside Fidel Castro's psychology here. It's completely different from Kennedy's or Khrushchev's.
Completely.
Yeah.
Kennedy and Khrushchev, for all their bluster, were trying to manage the crisis to survive. They wanted to find a way out. Castro was not operating on that logic. He saw himself as a messianic historical figure. He was willing to be a martyr for the cause.
He was preparing for what he saw as a Thermopylae moment, a glorious last stand against the American empire.
He was. And he went so far as to send a secret telegram to Khrushchev near the peak of the crisis, urging him, if the U.S. invaded, to launch a full-scale nuclear-first strike on the United States. Even knowing it would mean the complete annihilation of Cuba, he was advocating for a suicide pact.
And it wasn't just Castro. His second-in-command, Che Guevara, was out in the field.
Che had set up his command post in a series of caves in the western part of the island, the Cueva de los Portales. He was in command of the Western Cuban Army, ready to lead a guerrilla war if the Americans invaded. And this is a critical, often overlooked detail. While the Soviets maintained control over the big strategic missiles, for a period of time, the Cubans, under Che's command, had physical control or at least battlefield access to some of the tactical nuclear missiles, the short-range lunar rockets.
So if the U.S. invasion had happened, as LeMay wanted, the decision to use a tactical nuke on the beaches might not have come from Moscow. It could have come from Che Guevara in a cave.
It's very possible. And we know from Che's own writings after the crisis that he was furious the war didn't happen. He said that if the missiles had been under full Cuban control, they would have fired them at American cities.
The tension on the island must have been just unbearable, and it was made worse by the American low-level reconnaissance flights.
This is another one of those ground-level details from the book that really brings the tension to life. After the U-2 was shot down, the U.S. switched to these very fast, low-level flights. Navy Crusader jets screaming over the island at 500 feet, right over the treetops.
For the Cuban and Soviet soldiers on the ground, that must have been incredibly humiliating and frightening.
Totally. The noise was deafening, and they felt like sitting ducks. There's nothing they could do. And the American pilots started engaging in this psychological warfare. This is a detail you will never get in a standard textbook. They started stenciling little pictures of dead chickens on the fuselages of their planes for every successful mission they flew over Cuba.
Dead chickens? Why chickens?
It was a taunt. It was a reference to an old story that when Castro and his delegation came to the UN in New York years before, they had supposedly plucked live chickens in their hotel rooms, but it was also, a way of calling the Cubans chicken, mocking them for not being able to shoot back.
That is unbelievably provocative. You're basically daring them to shoot.
You are.
Yeah.
And the Cuban anti-aircraft gunners on the ground were seething. The pressure to fire back was becoming uncontrollable. Castro eventually gave the order to fire on any U.S. plane that flew over. It was another one of those sparks just waiting for the right gust of wind to start a wildfire.
So we've reached the end of our deep dive into the source material. And when you stack all these stories up, the exhausted submarine captains, the confused pilots, the freelance saboteurs, the fanatical leaders, it completely shatters the old, clean narrative of the crisis.
It really does. We love to tell this story as a triumph of cool, rational decision-making. That Kennedy played his hand perfectly, Khrushchev played his, and they managed to find a peaceful off-ramp. But the story Dobbs tells is that it was actually a victory of pure, dumb luck.
Just sheer luck.
The crisis wasn't solved by two men in a room. It was this sprawling, chaotic, global event that was constantly threatening to spin out of their control. The U.S. leadership had no idea about the tactical nukes on the island. The Soviet leadership had no idea that we could track their submarines so perfectly.
Any one of those subplots could have tipped the world into war.
The saboteurs getting caught, the F-106 pilot in Indiana having his plane blow up, the submarine captain with the nuclear torpedo losing his nerve. Any one of those things could have triggered the spasm response, regardless of what Kennedy or Khrushchev actually wanted.
That's the real 1 minute to midnight moment. It's not the ticking clock in the White House. It's the chilling realization of how little control the leaders at the top actually had over the vast, complex, and accident-prone machinery they had set in motion.
And that, I think, raises the big provocative question for us listening to this today. We live in a world that's even more complex. We have nuclear weapons, we have cyber warfare, we have AI-driven systems. And the question is, in a future crisis, can our leaders ever really control the outcome?
Or are we just relying on luck? Relying on the fact that the guy with the credit card at Logan Airport manages to buy the jet fuel in time?
It's a terrifying thought that our survival might depend on a single drag chute holding together, or a single angry soldier deciding not to fire his anti-aircraft gun at a low-flying plane.
It's humbling. History always looks so neat and inevitable when you look backwards, but in the moment, it's just a bunch of people, flawed and frightened, stumbling around in the dark.
Precisely.
Well, on that rather sobering note, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into 1 minute to midnight. It's a powerful reminder to always look beyond the official story, beyond the headlines, to the human messiness that lies underneath.
Always a pleasure.
We'll see you on the next deep dive. Stay curious, everyone.